Welcome, everyone. My name is Betty Pluis, and I'm a member of the steering committee of Climate Legacy. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this final session in our series of webinars sponsored by Climate Legacy and the Group of 78. This was the 8th one in the series, which has been focusing on the transition to a zero carbon economy. This one will focus on labor and what the implications of the transition will be for labor. So I'm going to turn it over to Armine Yalnizyan right now, and she will introduce the topic and our panelists for today. Over to you, Armine.
Thank you, Betty, and welcome to everybody this afternoon. You know, in the past 2 years, the war in Ukraine and the subsequent energy crisis have changed the energy crisis. The energy conversation from energy sustainability to now energy security and affordability. And that means that the short-term outlook for fossil fuels has become even more uncertain, and debate is even more polarized. In fact, just this week at COP28, we couldn't get global leaders to stand united in the mission to phase out fossil fuels in our search to decarbonize our future, though it's clear that we are going to blow past the 1.5 degree target for global warming, which is an existential warning if there ever was one. There are still proponents of drill, baby, drill among highly placed public and private decision makers, including leaders in Alberta. But if phase out isn't on the menu, transition certainly is, and it is gaining momentum globally. Just 3 weeks ago, the global management consultants that most of us on this call love to hate, McKinsey, reported that wind and solar will account for half of the world's energy supply in just a few years, 2030, less than a decade, and be the dominant source of global energy by 2040. And investments have doubled since last year, to over $3 trillion by 2030 is their estimate. At the beginning of this year, the World Economic Forum estimated that over 12.5 million people were working globally in the renewable energy sector. But just a few weeks ago, it was estimated that 1 million more workers had joined that workforce to help expand wind and solar energy production. And it is expected that by 2030, another 10 million people will be joining this labor market by 2030, vastly offsetting the expected loss of about 2.5 million jobs in the energy sector. When are we likely to see this displacement in Canada? The Canada oil and gas industry employed about 179,000 workers in September of 2023. That's less than 1% of our labor force. And that's dominated by 80% of those jobs are males that are filling those positions. The numbers of workers in the oil patch has actually grown over the course of 2023, up by 5% in exploration and over 1% in production compared to just August. This discussion that we are about to have is about the ups and downs of change, which are never linear. And no strangers to navigating the ups and downs of the economy. We have with us two veterans of transition in sectors that have seen massive transformation in the course of our lifetimes, in auto and steel. I'm referring to the wonderful Jim Stanford and the erudite Ken Delaney. Now, Jim Stanford probably needs no introduction to you all. He's the economist and director. He's an economist and the director of the Center for Future Work, which is a labor economics think tank with offices in Vancouver and Canberra, Australia. And of course, he's one of our best known economists, having served for over 20 years as chief economist and director of policy with Unifor, which is Canada's largest private sector trade union and was formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. He is everywhere in the media and also the Harold Innes industry professor in economics at McMaster University. And he's importantly the author of a book called Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, which received its second edition in 6 languages in 2015. So we welcome Jim to this conversation, and of course, Ken Delaney, who has been an expert in public policy, labor relations, and labor market decision-making for decades and decades. He was with steel. He helped guide their economics research and helped manage an incredibly tumultuous time in the steel industry. And he is also a managing director and partner in Prism Economics, as well as executive director of the Canadian Skills and Employment Coalition. So we welcome both of them. And I would like to turn to you immediately with our very first question, a question that certainly the group of 78 want to know the answers to, and so do I. What are the implications for workers of the transition to a zero carbon economy? Could you start us off, please, Ken?
Sure, absolutely, Armine, thanks. The quick answer to your question is depends on what you do for a living. The transition to a lower carbon economy doesn't have much of an impact on employment of economists. The three of us, if anything, it just gives us something else to talk about. But if you're a pipeline technician or a coal miner, it has a pretty big impact. And the impact is felt unevenly across sectors and occupations. I think that's the sort of first observation I have. The second is the nature of the change depends on the work itself, depends on whether you're changing the process or the product. If you're assembling a Ford F-150, your job doesn't change much when you're assembling the Lightning. There's a slight adjustment to bringing the battery in, but the job remains pretty much the same. But for other people, they'll lose their jobs. And unfortunately, right now, there's not much government support for this kind of transition. I remember back in the 80s when Canada signed the free trade agreement, there was a sense that there were going to be winning sectors and losing sectors, and the government and policymakers were interested in trying to help workers negatively impacted. Right now, unfortunately, there aren't any, and the implications are big. I'm going to talk a little bit some work I'm doing right now for the auto industry and for the federal government in documenting the economic and labor market implications of the transition to EVs. Can you throw my slide up there? Thank you much. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So we ran three economic scenarios. One, we assumed that consumers liked EVs, and so the transition to the EV was successful. We assumed that Canada got the battery plants that have been announced up and running, and that it continues to increase, and that it increases its total vehicle production back up to the range of 1.7, 1.8 million vehicles, and that we get our mining of rare earth minerals up to speed. And so if all that really good stuff happens, you can see from the numbers, that's the light blue bars there. The economic contribution to the economy is high. And in the second part of the slide, the employment side, you'll see that there's a net increase in jobs of 100,000. So so Canada's got a lot at stake, but there's a lot of questions. Will consumers really accept EVs? Will the incentives be enough? Will we be able to get our mining up and running? Will we be able to continue to win new production mandates? So we ran a second scenario where consumers like EVs, but we only get some of our mining operations up and running to produce the lithium, the manganese, the cobalt, and everything else that's needed to make the batteries. And under that scenario, there's a net increase of 25,000 jobs. But under the third scenario, there is, and that is where we get the battery plants, but we're still manufacturing some internal combustion engine plants or some internal combustion engine vehicles in 2040. Under that scenario, the jobs gained on the battery side are lost, or offset rather, by job loss in the manufacturing of transmissions, engine blocks, and various drivetrain components. So I think the big thing is it depends on the sector, and some of the implications for workers could be significant. And unfortunately, we don't have the kind of government policy to help workers in that transition. That's it.
Jim, what do you think?
Thanks, Armine, and thanks to Betty and your whole team and Roy, the group at 78, for the wonderful series that you put on and the wonderful impact you have on this dialogue. I'm really, really glad to join you. In terms of the overall impact of the energy transition on employment, in my judgment, honestly, it should be a non-issue. We are going to have gains and losses in different industries. Obviously, when you stop doing one thing and start doing another thing, that means the jobs associated with the thing you're not doing anymore are going to disappear, and the jobs associated with the thing you are doing are going to expand. This isn't new. This happens all the time in our economy, and we've had transitions in Canada's economy, given our dependence on staples-driven economic development. We've had transitions in the past that were much larger proportionately than the transition we're looking at to get off fossil fuels over the coming period. So there will be gains and there will be losses on a net basis, because fossil fuel production and use is such a capital intensive industry. There's very, very few jobs created in the oil industry, oil and gas industry, considering the value of the product that's produced and the amount of capital that's invested there. You can do almost anything else in the entire economy and get more bang for the buck in terms of employment impact from a given amount of capital investment or a given amount of production. So as you shift from fossil fuels to renewables, then you're going to have a net positive impact on employment. But at any rate, the overall level of employment in the economy is not dependent on what type of energy we use. It's dependent on how we run our economy. And we could still be, running the economy off of chopping down trees and burning them, not a very environmentally sustainable energy source, and still get to full employment as long as the macroeconomic levers were directed at getting to full employment. Or we could have, a very sophisticated, sustainable economy, net zero, that had high unemployment. If the macroeconomic levers were being run by people who thought, we should have high unemployment, and there are people out there who think that way. So this really should be a non-issue. There are much more important issues at stake around the future of the planet, and it's not the shift to renewables is not going to affect our overall employment perspective one way or the other. This is only an issue because the vested interests in the fossil fuel industry have made it an issue by manipulating their full concern for fossil fuel workers and saying you're going to jeopardize these good jobs, and that's too important. And there's a technical term in economics for that. It's called bullshit. It's hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, those people, the Premier of Alberta and the CEOs of Suncor and the other energy companies, do not care about the future of fossil fuel workers. In fact, they'll throw them on the street in an instant if they find a way to do the work cheaper. And we've seen that through all kinds of things, including technological change, the automated trucks that carry the bitumen around, the outsourcing to non-union labor and other anti-labor practices that those leaders of the fossil fuel industry have pursued. So they're manipulating people's concern with workers, including fossil fuel workers, and delaying and denying the transition is not helping fossil fuel workers. The transition will be much, much worse if we don't plan for it and support it and accelerate it, as opposed to pretending that this isn't happening and that we can somehow stop it. So we have to push back on the employment arguments, but from our perspective, it should be a non-issue.
Well, let me stick with you for a second, Jim, because I think to the extent that the idea of just transition has kind of gripped people's vocabulary, and you're saying that the transition is maybe moot, net, what would you say the components of a just transition should look like? Or do you even think the term is something we need to be considering?
Well, when I say the net impact is going to be moot and probably net positive, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues to be confronted on the way there. And so, we've done some research at our center. I'll put the link in the chat for people to check out. on the sorts of policies that would make that transition from the things we aren't going to do anymore to the things we are going to do as fair and smooth and painless as possible. Now, I will put my 2 bits in on this issue of just transition, the terminology. I don't like the word. I think it has lost its meaning and has been used in very kind of patronizing or shallow ways. And usually it backfires. In my experience, people working in fossil fuel industries in particular, when somebody comes and says, we're going to have a just transition for you, they usually put their hand on their wallet and run the other way. So as a pedagogical or communications device, I don't think the term just transition has paid off. And I think we should find other ways to phrase it. And I think that is what the federal government's doing and most unions are doing. That being said, the concept of supporting workers in all industries through this transition and other transitions, as Ken said at the beginning, we used to have an idea that you should support people if you had winners and losers in industries, especially when those winners and losers were the result of actual policy decisions. Nowadays, we just throw them out and say, well, this is a neoliberal labor market, fend for yourselves and try to make sure you've got the right skills. That will help you. So I would like the transition process to be supported. So all kinds of things can go into that. There's no one recipe, but it will include, first of all, retirements. Okay, most fossil fuel workers will retire by the time we get off of fossil fuels. If we set a 20 or 25-year transition to end fossil fuel use, which is reasonable and essential for the planetary goals, between now and the phase out of that period, most people working in the fossil fuel industry are going to retire anyway. So that's a pretty painless transition. In fact, you can encourage them to retire early for relatively small sums of incentive money. The key task is to prevent their vacancies from being filled by a new generation of fossil fuel workers, because that just makes the problem worse. So that highlights the fact that it has to be a planned transition. You need to have a timetable and targets that you meet on the way, as opposed to just back-end loading it and saying, well, we'll do something dramatic in 2050. That's how the codfish transition happened in Newfoundland, and it was not a pretty sight. That's how some of the forestry transitions have happened in British Columbia. Not a pretty sight. Much better to do it in a gradual, planned way, to give people notice, to adjust their life plans, and to take opportunities that come along the way. Third, you've got all kinds of different ways for the people who aren't going to retire by the time of the transition is finished. You've got all kinds of things that they could do. You could encourage and finance them to get new skills, move into new jobs. You could also have, if it's a planned transition, you can gradually shut down the industry by closing different facilities and then move people around so that the younger people can move to the facilities that are still operating, and older people at any location can retire even if their location wasn't closed yet. That's how we did it at Ontario Hydro when they got off of coal-fired generation without a single layoff. And that's how they did it in the German black coal industry. When they shut the whole industry down, 80,000 jobs over 20 years. That's a nice number, 20 years, without a single layoff. And then all kinds of different opportunities. People might want to take a package of money and go and start a small business. They might want to take a package of money and move back to Nova Scotia, if that's where they came from in northern Alberta. They might want to take a package of money and use that as income insurance if they took a job in another industry that didn't pay as well as the job that they had in the oil industry. A very rich portfolio of measures, but all told, very affordable if you phase it in over time. The planning aspect of it, I think, is the most critical component of a successful transition.
I am very struck by the degree to which you were talking about not just transitions in and out of work and maybe in and out of regions, but also the skill set. And of course, Ken, you are the maestro of skills and training. Can you please give us some insights from your perspective? What would be some of the core components of a just transition from a skills point of view?
Well, first, I agree with Jim. I don't like the term just transition either. I mean, that implies fairness and justice. And when I worked for the Steelworkers Union and when the government of Alberta hired me to advise them on the transition from coal-fired power generation to natural gas poweration, I met with a lot of coal miners. It'd be pretty hard to convince them that whatever is happening to them is justice or fair. So I don't like the term, I don't know what a good one is, effective transition mitigation or whatever. I don't know. There are people with marketing backgrounds that are better at this than I am. But in terms of what the elements are, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to understand the regional labor market, where the jobs are, where they're not, where the shortages are, where there's opportunity. Then there's the question of the first thing you want to try to do is you want to try and retain jobs. So for example, there could be an opportunity at Algoma Steel, which is transitioning from an electric arc, from a integrated steel mill to an electric arc furnace. You can save some of those jobs that might otherwise be lost by training people to work in the new facility. And in fact, CSTEC is actually helping Algoma accomplish that. But in other cases, like with Walker Exhaust, a company in Cambridge, Ontario, EVs don't need exhaust system. That plant's going to close. There is no other place for them to transition to. So for those people, you want to try to find a new job for them. I'll just throw one idea. Can I have my other slide, my skills transferability matrix slide, please? The next one. There you go. So I'll just quickly explain what this is. What we've done is we've broken down the number of skills, technical skills, duties, responsibilities using the same system. Armine and Jim, you'll know ONET and the U.S. Department of Labor data on this. And we use artificial intelligence to look through to find out commonality in skills and tasks. And the idea is to help build bridges for people that, like, if you're working in a muffler plant and there's a transition, you're just going to lose your job. And so something like this may help some of those workers that are losing their jobs find other occupations that they can transfer into. Okay, that's it. You can take the slide off. That was just a quick look at what a skills transferability matrix might look like. Then there's also maybe assistance in moving. So there's providing better labor market information. There's providing upskilling for existing workers. There's providing relocation assistance and retraining for workers that can't find their jobs. And as Jim mentioned, like the old standby that we used to use in the steel industry when jobs were lost to technological change was early retirements and trying to get people out more quickly. But right now, there isn't a comprehensive a program that any government in Canada has for this change. And I think the rate of change today, due to technological change and developments, is at least as great as the rate of change was in the 80s when we signed the free trade agreement with the United States. So I think those programs are necessary.
So why don't you tell us what you think the governments should be doing, and perhaps what the unions should be doing in the structured transition that we are all hoping will materialize sometime in the next little while?
Well, I think it would be easier to convince people on this transition if we didn't dismiss it and we acknowledge that for some people this is a really difficult transition, and that there's a role for government in helping them make that transition. So that's the number one thing. I think better labor market analysis, and then it's the kinds of things that I mentioned. It's programs to help early retirement, programs to help upskill existing workers transition into new jobs, programs what used to be called labor adjustment, programs to help them move on, incentives for early retirement. But I think just simply getting a program in place that recognizes that this is a real problem for some workers, and that they require help, because this, like the free trade agreement, is a public policy decision. So I think they require the assistance. That's the biggest things. With respect to unions, I mean, they are doing that. I mean, Unifor has been active to keep jobs that they might lose in other locations in the new Stellantis battery plant. And the steelworkers have tried to mitigate the implication of Algoma transitioning to an electric arc furnace by doing the same thing. So I think the two unions that I work with most closely, and I know the best, are kind of both actively engaged in this right now. So they are doing that kind of work.
I guess I will ask the same question of Jim, but feel free, both of you, to jump in as to whether the role of unions is primarily to negotiate with the employers or primarily to push the government. And I am using the word primarily very, very heavily. As in, is this a campaign for a concerted program, or is that really something that you do workplace by workplace to try and get a better deal?
Well, on that, I think it's both, and in fact, you've left out a third one, which is to primarily work with their own members around educating and organizing and mobilizing their own members. So first of all, that union members are not used as a weapon against decarbonization. That's what we definitely want to prevent. But also so that members have education and awareness of what the issues are, what the issues aren't. They're inoculated against the fake propaganda that they'll get from the oil industry and Danielle Smith and so on. But definitely negotiate with the employers to demand that workers have not just are consulted in the design of this transition plan, but are in fact at the table with real negotiating power around both the timing of the transition and the sorts of policies and supports that are going to be offered, just as we would be at the table in negotiating a plant closure agreement or a restructuring agreement with companies. And of course, unions have to be engaged in the broader policy and political battles. Right now, we're facing a terribly frightening prospect that you could have a Poilievre government that just rips up everything that's been done on climate policy over the last decade. That would be an absolute tragedy. So, in the political realm, working with governments of all stripes to make sure that policies work and can be shown to work, but also fighting hard against the retrograde risk that we face from this new right-wing populism. In terms of what are the things, the key things, the first question that you asked, Ken, Armine, I think one game changer would be as part of a transition planning package to say we're not going to have involuntary layoffs without income insurance. I think that is possible economically. Even for the person in an exhaust plant, exhaust systems aren't going to be made anymore, or the person in an oil refinery when it shuts down. I think it's possible to make the overarching goal being, no one is going to be thrown out on the street as a result of this, and we'll make sure there's a spate of supports that respect people's individual choices about what they want to do. Do they want to retire? Do they want to keep working? Do they want to keep working somewhere else in the same industry? Do they want to work in a completely different industry? And that guarantee that they will not be they will not be shouldering the burden of that overall energy restructuring. I think that is a feasible goal. It has been achieved in practice in real transitions in and around the world. I mentioned the phase out of German coal. That was done without any involuntary layoffs. And there's other examples from Spain, from Netherlands, the Ontario Hydro one I mentioned. But it would, I think, be a game changer in terms of neutralizing the fake manipulation of workers' futures as a playing card in this whole debate. So, I'd like to set that as an overarching goal. Then governments, in order to achieve the sort of planned gradual transition that I've been talking about, are going to need the authority to impose planning on the industry. And that's, a foreign concept in a privatized, fragmented industry like fossil fuels in most parts of Canada, where you're actually going to have to require companies to close their facilities at certain points in time in order to meet that timetable. In Germany, they nationalized the industry to do that, to give themselves the authority to shut down coal mines in different parts of the country on a timetable. They nationalized it. In Queensland, Australia, they're going to do the same thing now. They have public ownership of the energy generation plants, and that allows them, as happened in Ontario, to close them on a timetable. In Canada's case in fossil fuels, that will be a challenge, because each individual group of owners or capitalists who run each individual fossil fuel company are going to want to make the most money that they can out of what's left, what time is left for the industry. And so in that regard, we get into a bigger discussion about the need for planning and perhaps public ownership as part of facilitating a transition that works for everyone.
I'm going to use my job as moderator to actually ask you to double down on your conversation about what happened in Queensland and what happened in Germany. When you do nationalize a sector, how much of a payout is there to be able to take over what are profitable operations? And in Canada, as I mentioned in my opening comments, we're growing the sector. We're not winding it down.
I mean, in Germany's case, they bought the industry, so they didn't expropriate the industry. So it is expensive in that regard, but it was supported, in a kind of a tripartite structure, and I think it made the planning of the shutdown of the industry more feasible and less costly in terms of the overall, certainly social and fiscal and employment impacts of the thing. So, it might seem far-fetched to say we should nationalize the oil industry in order to shut it down. And obviously it would be hugely controversial. But at least as identifying the need for planning and the authority to plan, that could be held out as the ultimate option. Short of that, we could say to companies in the oil and gas sector, you're going to have to follow these regulations. Now, in Canada, this is proving to be a very, very difficult challenge. Just look at the debates over some of the federal environmental rules and the fight back from provinces that they've exceeded their authority, and now we're going to have the same fight over this emissions cap that the federal government has implemented. So, I don't want to be too naive about the prospects of doing this, but one way or another, we're going to have to confront the power and the vested interest of the fossil fuel industry, which I actually don't agree is growing. Production is growing, but in the longer term perspective, employment is not growing. The companies are not reinvesting. They're paying out these huge profits that they're making in dividends and share buybacks to investors. And ultimately, they know this industry is going to disappear, but they are going to make as much money as they possibly can in the meantime. And they'll manipulate every political process that they can to preserve the right to do that. And so, one way or another, we're going to have to defeat their power in order to win a transition period, let alone a transition that works. And that's where the debate to show fossil fuel workers, what? This industry is going to disappear one way or the other. You're much better off if we've got a plan that allows you to negotiate that process without losing your job and with the full support of a multifaceted transition plan. I think in the end that will be more politically successful.
So we've talked a lot about producers and governments and workers, and what we haven't talked about is us as consumers and what our role should be in hastening this process of decarbonizing. After all, supply is at least partly affected by demand. So I'm wondering what pair of suggestions you two have about what we on this call and more broadly can do to hasten the transition. Ken, can I start with you?
Sure. I think, I guess first I would just want to say that it isn't just the oil and gas industry that we're talking about on this transition. The four biggest CO2 emitters in Ontario are in order: Dofasco, Stelco, Algoma Steel, and what used to be Inco. So there's steel, there's mining, and in the automotive supply chain, if we make the transition to EVs, it's some SMEs, family-owned businesses with 200-300 employees that are So I guess my first advice is to try to stay away from the highly rhetorical stuff and try to acknowledge that this is actually a real problem for those workers that are going to be impacted. I mean, there's all kinds of highly rhetorical stuff. Even the concept of green jobs has never made sense to me. So there's a guy that's driving a truck for Algoma Steel today. Well, it's an integrated steel mill. He delivers hot rolled coils. So Algoma transitions to an EAF. Now all of a sudden that truck driver's job is a green job. So I would like to stay away from the highly rhetorical stuff and try to get down to the specifics. I mean, even sorry, Jim, maybe you're braver than I am, but I'm not going to advise these people to lobby for nationalizing the oil and gas industry, because I think that's a non-starter, and it would cause all the doors to slam in their face when they tried to talk to people. For me, I think simply acknowledging that of course, number one, this transition is critical. Don't get me wrong. I in no way am suggesting we don't have to make this transition, but being realistic that some people pay a much higher price to this transition than others, and that there's a strong role for government and other stakeholders to facilitate that movement is singularly the most important thing that regular people can do, is to become aware of this and to advocate for, if we're not going to use the word just transition, and I don't like it either, whatever it is, effective climate change mitigation or something, I don't know. But anyway, I mean, that's that's what I would like to see.
Stick to the economics, Ken, not the advertising department. We'll work on finding the verbiage that works.
Jim, what do you think we should be doing? Us on the call, us generally.
Yeah, well, I think us on the call are all on the call because we're committed to being active in trying to shape the future of our society. And I think that's the ultimate choice we make. The consumption choice is part of it. I don't think is going to make a difference in the long run. I've always been skeptical of the idea that green consumer choices will really make much difference outside of the structure and regulatory dimensions of our economy. And what we should be doing is fighting for policies that prohibit and restrict the types of things that are dangerous and unsustainable, and facilitate shifts towards things that are better. And ethically, as individuals, we can all choose what we'd like to buy and so on, and that's great. But that isn't going to win the day in the end. It's a political struggle that's going to win the day in the end. And Ken, I hear you about not going out and making nationalization the center of it, but I think as a pedagogical device to show that it's the power wielded by those individual privately owned firms that's standing in the way of us saving our planet and saving our jobs. I think we can make those points and then end up with a system that perhaps is more incrementalist, but ultimately has to take on and regulate the power of those individual firms to say, because I own this oil company, I'm going to produce it till the cows come home or until the planet catches fire. And that is unacceptable to the rest of us. And we have to be ready to challenge that.
However, the party in charge of the biggest part of this noise happening in the oil and gas industry is talking about seizing public pension plans to be able to invest them to do exactly that. So if you want to
that's a
talk
good
about
point.
Like
Nationalizing,
crazy nationalizing. Yeah, it's not like it's not happening. It is happening. At least the threat of it is happening, and it hasn't been like waved off outright. So I would like to give a nod to the audaciousness of some parties, and that maybe we do need to be more audacious. I recognize that it's time to move into the question period, and we only have one question in the booth. And it's a great question, but to give you guys a little, you on the call that are not the speakers, a little chance to put in your question in the chat box, I'm going to ask another question just to prime your brains while we are having this conversation so that you also can join in. I've touched a little bit about electing a conservative government in Alberta and how polarized the moment is and how people align themselves sometimes in things that don't help. And both of you have basically said it's the production side, it's not the consumption side. Does that let us off the hook too much as consumers?
Well, I'll give you so in my house, we compensate by paying more money for stuff. Like you can, the eggs we eat have to, my wife, Joy, makes sure that these are the most loved and respected chickens in the world laying her eggs, and we pay more. And so it's easier for us economists to support from a consumer side these kinds of things than it is for ordinary working people. I mean, it just is. For all the ethical meats, and look at the price of the EVs. I mean, to tell you the truth, one of the things I really worry about is, advocates of the transition are quick to say that this is going to happen because the OEMs and the government has indicated they've set a target of 2035. I mean, there's reasons why the OEMs are behind it. And that's because they know that they can make more money selling EVs than they can internal combustion engine vehicles. I mean, surprise, surprise. Because I remember the period when they shifted. Initially, they were incredibly opposed to it, and then they figured out that they loved it. So I think from the consumer side, to some extent, what we get to choose as consumers is dictated by the people that make the products. So I'm kind of with Jim on this. I think that yeah, there are limits. It's to me, I think it's more of it makes you feel better about yourself. I mean, it does. But I think getting at the production side is a much more powerful means.
Thank you. Jim, did you want to chime in there, or shall we move on to the questions?
Oh, let's move on to the audience. I wouldn't have much to add to that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, here we have a great question about if we elect a Conservative government in Ottawa, which may be more on the menu than it was even a year ago. How might the plans to decarbonize be affected in both of your views? Jim, why don't you start?
Well, it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a disaster for the climate and a disaster for society. There's no doubt about it. We'll see what the eventual Conservative platform involves, but it obviously will involve an end to the federal provincial carbon pricing system as probably the first act of a Conservative government. And that is going to throw all of the renewable investment plans into turmoil, whether it's in renewable energy or transmission or the various industries, including the EV industry, that use renewable energy as an input or that are tied one way or another to the energy transition. The outlook for the business cases for those undertakings is going to be thrown into turmoil by the elimination of a carbon pricing plan that was, essential to the decision of those projects to go ahead. Now, the government is to some extent anticipating and trying to mitigate this risk through these contracts for difference idea that they're using now. In fact, they're going to use a big chunk of the $15 billion infrastructure fund to pay for these contracts for difference, which are a way of assuring companies basically that even if Poilievre comes to power and rips up the carbon pricing system, their business cases will be protected. So this is, in a way, a very interesting contrast. Imagine if workers had that. Imagine if workers had a contract for difference that said, regardless of what happens to your job in the future, we're still going to pay you. That more or less is what the government is indicating might happen through this. So, that's a complicated issue for us to think about. It's in a way another huge form of corporate subsidy. On the other hand, it is a way of trying to lock in some of the parameters of this carbon pricing system and insulate it against a future Poilievre government. There'll be all kinds of other things a Poilievre government does support for further fossil fuel expansion, pipelines, of course, attacks on labor, to the extent that the federal jurisdiction is able to, and that is significant. If you recall what Harper did, Poilievre was in Harper's cabinet when this happened. So remember this when Poilievre tries to present himself as friend of the workers, and this is the working class rebelling. Not so. But there'll be all kinds of risks. If it happens, well, first of all, we all have to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen. And then if it happens, we have to dig in and defend and resist. We survived Harper. We survived Mike Harris. We've survived other despots in the past, and we will survive Poilievre, but it will be a huge setback for us, absolutely.
I want to move to another question because I'm aware that the clock is ticking, and I'm going to turn to Bessa Whitmore's question about the technology. She mentioned the technology of TVs is changing quickly from the present heavy batteries using lithium to lighter, more effective batteries. Could you, Ken, comment on the wisdom of buying an EV or any technology right now in the short term, given how quickly the technology is changing?
Well, yeah, it is changing quickly, but factories, in order to keep vehicles to be able to keep the price down low enough for most people to buy them, they have to be made on huge scale. And so that involves a lot of capital spending. So people will make bets. Like, yes, the technology is changing quickly. Hydrogen is another option that people are exploring. And in fact, I've heard a talk of the use of hydrogen in the steel industry, actually, to power electric arc furnaces as well. But the way it looks right now, it'll be the types of batteries that are the plans currently are to produce the big lithium batteries, and there's a lot of questions related to getting that mining up and running. In terms of what to do, like, should you buy one now on the risk? I mean, if you're asking, like, my advice as a consumer, should you buy an EV? Wow, I just tried to show you in my first slides how many variables there are and how this could go one way or the other way. I'll tell you on a personal level, considering what I do for a living, like I want to do, and my 2017 Ford Escape is ready to be turned over to my son. And so what am I going to buy? I mean, I'll probably buy a hybrid because I think, unfortunately, the transition is going to be much slower than anyone on this call would like to admit. And so I want to kind of be ready for anything, so to speak. I mean, that's my advice as a consumer. I just want to add to something that Jim mentioned, talking about Poilievre. It isn't just the election here in Canada that we have to worry about. We absolutely have to worry about the election south of the border, because if incentives to buy EVs are killed in the United States, and demand for EVs in the United States falls dramatically, well, the economic benefits of our new battery plants ain't looking so good anymore. And what Canada may get from any additional EV production is also damaged. So the politics are important, but in an integrated economy, is particularly a sector like the automotive sector, Jim, you know that you can pour steel in Hamilton, ship it to Detroit, get it stamped into a door, and then back across the river. Like the same components will cross the border more than once before it comes off the assembly line. So that's a big issue too, the election in the United States. But from a consumer's perspective, yeah, I guess I'm going to go hybrid.
There is a lot of international discussion in this board, and I'd like to lift up Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood's question, which is directed to Jim. You've mentioned German coal, Jim, and there are many more examples of countries that are moving further and faster than Canada on climate, such as China on EVs, the US currently on green industrial policy, and Denmark on phasing out oil. But it seems like in our country, the main political narrative is that we are shooting ourselves in the foot with climate policy while the rest of the world carries on as it did before, basically no change. So how can we bring more of the international context, particularly the type of examples you've raised, into the domestic debate so that we are positioning ourselves as either laggards or leaders?
Well, that's a great question. Thanks, Adrian. And I'm not entirely sure I've got the answer, other than to keep doing what we're all trying to do, including through our research, our publications, our op-eds, our webinars like this one, our activism, and our political campaigns. The fossil fuel industry, again, and its apologists, has argued from the beginning that Canada is too small to do anything about the international climate change problem, and they just want us to free ride on the efforts that other countries take. And from a narrow self-interest perspective of the fossil fuel industry, that might make sense. But obviously, from our collective point of view, if our standing back from the global effort to rein in this problem further weakens the chances of having it reined in. And we've watched with horror at COP28 what the fossil fuel industry has been able to do there to take away the idea of even phasing it out. We have to be part of that collective action solution to a collective action problem. And we're going to see this debate big time, of course, with the emissions cap. Imperfect as it is, at least it has recognized that the oil and gas sector is the dominant source of our greenhouse gas problems and has to play a unique and specified role in solving that problem, rather than the carbon pricing purists who say, no, don't single anyone out, just put the carbon price on and let the market decide. That's an absolutely false argument economically, and it hasn't worked politically. As you'll see, the carbon tax is in political trouble, despite the supposed consistency with the principles of free market economics that some of its advocates have promoted. So they are saying we're the only major oil producing country in the world that is going to propose a cap on how much we produce. And, that really is just a reflection of the power of the oil industry around the world. So if we can set a precedent in that regard, that even a country with all kinds of oil and gas still under the ground can say, no, it has to stay under the ground, that makes an incremental contribution to the global solution.
Robin Collins has another question regarding transportation, which seems to be the big driver of, what can we do as individuals? How about the same? How about your views, Ken? I'll ask you about moving to mass transportation rather than personal EVs. Of course, it's not for everybody in city dwellers, says Robin. I would hasten to add that about 80% of the population live in some kind of dense conglomeration of people. And the question is, should we be careful about electric cars, yes or no, advocacy?
Well, I mean, I'm all for improved mass transit, but again, I urge everybody to avoid the polemic and try and be realistic. There was an article in the Toronto Star about how the slowest way to get from the corner of King and Jarvis to the corner of King and Bathurst is to take a streetcar. By walking, you can get there more than twice as fast than by taking the streetcar. So, Toronto has more cranes in the air right now, all the construction, than any city in North America. And so, like mass transit solutions as ways to get people out of cars is absolutely fantastic. It's also a long way away from where we are today. I mean, look at how much difficulty we've had getting the Eglinton Crosstown built. So I think that it's I think mass transit certainly is very important, and I think the transition to EVs, the crisis is severe enough that I think it should be sort of all hands on deck. Of course, we should be trying to increase public transit. Of course, we should be trying to encourage the transition to EVs. And people may not like this, but if you can't get out of fossil fuel completely, but you can cut your emissions in half by switching from coal to natural gas, you should switch to natural gas. Like I think all of those things, if that can be done quickly, as it was done in Alberta with the power plants. So I think the answer is sort of all hands on deck, but be realistic and not overly idealistic in your prescriptions for solving the problem.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't get to all of the questions. There's some great ones. There's one here, a point. It's not really a question, it's a point that Charles Novogrodsky makes, that maybe what the union's role should include is a guide to greenwashing. And for either one of you that have got ins with the House of Labor, maybe that is a terrific new economics for everyone, Jim. And I'd like to I'm about to turn it over to to Betty, I guess. But I just want to end by saying that, as we all have experienced in our lives, change happens very slowly, super slowly, and then all at once. I think there are always decision makers who are going to delay inevitable change, whether they're producers or workers, because there's money to be made. And there's going to be governments that want to delay because consumers and voters are not ready yet to radically change their behavior. But we all know on this call that change is coming, It's accelerating despite all the resistance. And the only question that remains is, will we do too little, too late? I would like to thank very sincerely the group of 78 for organizing this afternoon together. And I want to give a special shout out to Ken Delaney and Jim Stanford for decades of remarkable economic insight and experience. Thank you very much for including me in this afternoon. Betty?
Right back at you, Armine. Thank you for this and for everything else you do.
Well, I want to thank all of you on behalf of Climate Legacy and also the G78. Armine, you did a terrific job of moderating. You kept these two guys in check, and we got through in an hour, just like you promised. That's fantastic. Also, Jim and Ken, thank you. Wonderful experience, and your insights are really helpful to all of us in trying to understand these very difficult and complex questions. Also, to the participants, thank you for their really insightful questions and careful attention to what was being said. I'd like to thank Eric Murphy and Maud Stefani from the Group of 78 and Climate Legacy for the technical support and promoting the event. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be up shortly on the websites of Climate Legacy and the Group of 78. And also, I'd like to mention the Group of 78's annual conference in next fall. We'll be looking at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which will be an important tool that people can use given the failure of COP28 to really address the issue of fossil fuel phase out in a way that we need to do it. So thanks, everyone. Happy holidays, and many thanks to all of you for your participation.